Hey guys, Robert here with the content presentation for the 57 bus. I had the benefit of never hearing about the events of this book somehow before reading it, so this was a bit of a roller coaster for me, and I am excited to talk about it with you guys. Since this is a nonfiction book, I think it's useful to just briefly talk about what happened. Essentially, the events of the book revolve around two teens from completely different backgrounds meeting one fateful day on the 57 bus, as the name of the book implies. On the one hand, we have a queer teen who was the victim of an attack from a young person of color, and that's kind of how the media spun this story as, this young black teen attacking another white teen. But that's not really quite everything. It's not spun in that way in this book. I think the book tells the events of the story from both sides in a way that's exceedingly fair and well researched, and that's demonstrated, um, in the way that Slater shows her methodology and stuff like that. And I think that this book really shows the nuance of the events and the gray area and the many emotions and motivations that live inside of that gray area about what happened, and it's not quite as simple as the media would have you believe. So, starting with the book and the author, the book itself is presented in a very interesting way that I don't think I've seen very often in literature in general, and even more so specifically with like YA. Oftentimes, a lot of nonfiction books are written kind of without as much as emotion, maybe outside of like memoirs and autobiographies and stuff like that. Um, there's a certain layer of protection, this veil between the events of what's happening and the characters, or quote unquote characters, the people that it's happening to. So I think this book is written in such a way that even though the events are factual, you really get the emotions of the people that these things happen to. And I think that Slater does a great job of researching and talking to those people. She was one of the first reporters who reported on the incident, and that eventually ended up in this book. And so, yeah, she does a great job of personifying the people and making them feel both real, because obviously they are, but also relatable in a way that I think we don't see very often in nonfiction, specifically for YA too. I haven't, even in general, I don't think I've seen very much YA nonfiction, so that was kind of a treat to read. Her background as a journalist is also very clear in her excellent research and the standard of truth that she presents at the beginning of the novel. I would say that this book is one part prose and one part journalism, which for me is really exciting, and I don't think we see very often outside of, again, memoirs, which are about the people who, actually the events happen to, and other autobiographical writings and movies and documentaries or podcasts like This American Life and that kind of thing. Some of the themes and motifs I took note of as we were reading, um, kind of broadly speaking, gender and more generally identity, which I think are two things that many young adults have their mind on, especially growing up in today's date where those things are a little bit more normal and people can feel more accepted. I also think that there was a lot of focus on language and the weaponization of that language in certain parts, specifically the way people would forget to use Sasha's preferred pronouns, or the way the media latched onto the way Richard self-described himself as a homophobe, despite his lack of knowledge of what that word really meant. And more generally, I think that this story talks about how people fit into the world around them on like a macro scale. Where we come from, unfortunately, sometimes has a lot to do with where we're going. And this story is a tragic intersection between two very different people with two very different lives. So, given those themes and motifs, what can teens get from this book? I think this book is really nuanced and kind of lives in this gray zone. And that's kind of how the world is. The world is scary and complicated. And I think Slater did a great job at showing what Richard did was wrong and terrible, but that also the way he was initially described by the media and used as a scapegoat and an example were also wrong. The forgiveness and graciousness of Sasha and their family is so powerful in this book, and the understanding they have towards why things happen the way they did, I think is a really huge message to teens that radical kindness is an incredible force for change. That isn't to say that Richard shouldn't have gotten any kind of punishment or that there aren't consequences for our actions, but sometimes the hard thing of being loving in a world that feeds on fear and outrage, sometimes that lovingness is the only way to starve those darker tendencies. Getting a little bit into like the controversies of the book, this one, like most books that involve any kind of race or gender, justice or topics, has been met with disdain from groups. As you can see from the graph on this slide, a vast majority of books that receive bans deal with those two things, and this book is kind of a double whammy in that sense. Generally speaking, though, this book has been well received aside from a small but vocal minority, it seems. I think there are definite parallels between this book and a few we've read in this class so far. A couple that come to mind are A Long Way Down and The Poet X for me. But aside from the course required books, I thought of two books while reading this. In terms of themes, I think that Carry On by Rainbow Rowell talks a lot about the struggles of teens and their burgeoning identities. Rainbow Rowell also wrote one of the books that we'll be reading later on in this course, Eleanor and Park. Um, and though it's kind of set in a fantasy world, we're definitely set in a fantasy world. It talks a lot about queer folks, and it follows two teens from very different worlds and how they reconcile those pasts in relation to their future. Um, Additionally, I think that the autobiographical graphic novel Blankets by Craig Thompson has a very similar vibe to the 57 Bus. It's a story about the author and his relationship that he has with his religious background and the coming of age that he went through alongside someone that he met at a camp, who again is from a very different life. Both of these books are easily 10 out of 10s for me. And though they're very different in a lot of ways from the 57 Bus, I think the heart of both of these books is in a similar place. I hope you guys enjoyed reading this book as much as I did. I'm going to be posting a couple interviews with the author in the discussion board, as well as some questions to kind of get the discussion started. I look forward to chatting with you guys about it in the comment section. See you there.